200 kilometres south of Perth lies a town most people have heard of, yet know very little about. Collie plays a significant role in supplying electricity to both Perth and country areas from the Muja and Collie coal-fired power stations. The area is rapidly becoming one of Western Australia's most important water catchments for agricultural use and metropolitan drinking water. Since European settlement, large areas around Collie have been cleared for agriculture and mining, and the remaining forested area has been intensively and repeatedly logged. These forests are an integral part of the catchment, which feeds both the Wellington and Harris dams. So the health of these forests is essential for the protection of water quality. Wellington Dam was constructed to meet the requirements of the South West and the Great Southern for drinking water. It once supplied 31 towns. However, as a result of native forest clearing for pasture development, salinity levels in the reservoir have risen to the point where it is no longer suitable for drinking. Because of this, a second reservoir, the Harris Dam, was completed in 1990, and the plan now is for water from the Wellington and Harris dams to be blended, and then pumped into the Stirling Dam 16 kilometres to the northwest. This shandying effect, as it's known, is intended to provide drinking water for Perth metropolitan requirements. The Collie area is classified as a Class A recovery catchment, which means it is supposed to be managed as a priority catchment for reversing the impacts of salinity. However, there are still major problems with salt and other pollutants entering the waterways. This is water that the people of Perth will be drinking in the near future. The salt-polluted east branch of the Collie River is just one source which feeds the Wellington Dam, dumping more than 49,000 tonnes of salt into the reservoir every year. The total salt inflow into the Wellington Dam from the Collie recovery catchment is a staggering 128,000 tonnes per year. This is nearly double the level set under the World Health Organization guidelines for drinking water. According to the Water and Rivers Commission, clearing controls on public land, together with revegetation in the Collie catchment, have stopped the increase in salinity levels. However, logging operations in the native forests of the Collie catchment are being allowed to continue at unprecedented rates, regardless of salinity and other environmental concerns. The effects of salinity can be seen along the Bingham River Reserve, where large amounts of native vegetation continue to die at alarming rates. CSIRO research from as far back as 1978 shows that this area contains over 300 tonnes per hectare of salt stored in the soil above the groundwater. Western Australia's unique forests were once dominated by magnificent trees that formed part of healthy ecosystems, fully adapted to Australian conditions, including droughts and wildfires. Decades of felling trees much faster than they can regrow have resulted in native forests resembling little more than stands of telephone poles, with only a small scattering of larger trees left. Although some are in protected reserves, many are still being logged by industry. Most of the magnificent large jarrah trees were removed early last century. A maze of rail lines wove their way through the forests and was used for transporting logs to the mills. This line has been reconstructed on an old clearing using original wooden rails found in the area. The use of these rail lines was widespread, from Perth throughout the southwest to Leonora in the east. Remnants of equipment and unused logs can still be seen from when this line was closed down in the late 1920s. Teddy Bear Mill closed at the beginning of World War I, when workers volunteered for active service. Because we know the date the mill closed, we're able to get an accurate picture of what genuine jarrah regrowth forest looks like. By comparing some of the abandoned logs at the mill with the regrown trees, we get an idea of how long it will take for these forests to recover, and an understanding of the time it takes for jarrah to mature. 90 years on, and these trees are nowhere near millable size, and the forest understory hasn't begun to recover. A smattering of large trees spared by the loggers give an indication of what has been lost. The large workforce employed by the logging industry in previous generations has to a great extent been replaced by machinery. Logging now requires only a fraction of the workforce of previous years. Trees that once took hours to fall are now cut down in minutes. These days, most forest blocks are logged by a workforce of just 3 people. One person felling the trees with a chainsaw, another collecting the logs with a machine called a forwarder or skidder, and also operating a loader to arrange the logs on the landing, and a truck driver to take the logs to the mill. The efficiency and economic advantages of the system is obvious. The collateral destruction overwhelming. The forestry practices used by the Forest Management Agency, the Department of Conservation and Land Management, CALM, include the removal of banksia trees. Rather than employing a chainsaw operator to remove the banksia trees, CALM uses a large logging machine to simply smash down the bush. In this case, a skidder that was being used to pick up the occasional fallen log has smashed its way through the forest, resulting in the destruction of many marri, jarrah, she-oak trees and balgas. Breaches of logging regulations result in yet further damage to the forest fauna and flora. Here a ring marked on a tree to show that it should not be cut down has been cut off in an attempt to hide the evidence of logging vandalism. The same disregard for regulations is evident with the knocking down of trees marked with an H for retention as fauna habitat. The maximum number of habitat trees required to be retained is between 4 and 6 per hectare. This tree has been marked for retention as a habitat tree. However, its young age and small size make it of far less habitat value than a large old tree. It's common practice for smaller trees to be marked in this way, as larger trees are in demand by industry, to be used as saw logs or for charcoal in the production of silicon. The summer of 2003 saw the logging of several forests in the Collie Cachment. Flay's Forest, northeast of Collie, is a typical example of modern forest logging. All of the mature old-growth trees have been systematically removed and the understory trashed by large machinery, leaving only stands of thin young trees. Apart from the damage done by logging, large areas are destroyed in the construction of logging roads. The forest is also pockmarked with the many gravel pits dug to provide material to surface these roads. Often these gravel pits are in dieback infected areas, and as a result, gravel contaminated with the disease is spread to other uninfected forests. Logging machines moving on and off these roads then spread the dieback throughout the forests. Although there are numerous regulations that are supposed to prevent the spread of dieback, they are grossly inadequate and are generally ignored. A drive anywhere through this forest shows that it is already under considerable stress from previous logging operations. The dying crowns seen everywhere in flays were not caused by fire damage, which often occurs during intensive prescribed burns, but because overcutting has severely undermined the forest's ecosystem. Due to forest mismanagement and inappropriate logging practices, logging operations generate large amounts of so-called waste. According to the government agency that controls logging operations, the Forest Products Commission, in order to get 140,000 cubic metres of first and second grade jarrah saw logs, the loggers will cut another 380,000 cubic metres of lower grade jarrah logs. This figure, confirmed at an eco-forestry forum held in Bunbury in March 2002, does not include any of the trees of other species, the understory or ground-level vegetation.
People like myself that own land can't use this timber. We're not allowed to touch it for fence posts, chook runs, anything like that. The woodcutters are not allowed to come in here because of DRA, disease risk areas. They're not allowed to take it. So it's just going to lay here on the forest floor to be burnt, charred, that doesn't even make it good habitat quality. The destruction of the flora and fauna because of all this is amazing. As you can see through the forest, you can't even hear the birds. There's no insects, you don't see kangaroos, there's nothing. It's just a sterile area at the moment. This is going to take years and years to come back, and they're continually doing this. All through the areas around Collie are the same.
In Roseneath Forest, just south of Collie, we can see how much of the resource is scandalously wasted. Many of the logs are left in the forest simply because they weren't perfectly straight, and therefore wouldn't fit on the truck easily. The shorter pieces are usually the ends of logs that were cut off to make the logs the right length to fit on the truck. Although they may be as big as tree trunks, because the branches from the crowns of the trees are not dead straight, they are left to be burned. The price that log buyers in WA pay for native forest logs is based on the cost of growing the trees. This means that even under the best scenario, the state does not make a single cent from having native forests logged. With native forest logs so cheap, there is little reason for companies to concern themselves with this waste. It's cheaper for them to simply cut down more trees to get exactly what they want. The low prices also mean it is more difficult for plantation timber to compete, and as a result, several plantation businesses have already gone broke. Ashley Davidson and his family are now starting to feel the effects of salination on their orchard east of Collie.
We live here in the middle of, in between Leach Block and Flays Block. When we first moved here, we thought about getting the electricity on, but we found out that because we were in a AA catchment area, to knock down any trees to put a power line in, we would have had to replant the equivalent amount of area with the species of the Rivers and Waters Commission choice. We had to deep rip the area, fence it, vermin proof it, water the trees for 3 years. There had to be an 80% success rate of the trees, so it was just out of the question, so we went solar instead. We lived here because we liked being in the forest. We thought when we first got here, beauty, you know, middle of the forest, we put down a bore, and we found out that the water in the bore, after we'd put the windmill on it, it was had 15,000 parts per million salt, which was useless. You couldn't even use it in our septics. So we had to put in a big rainwater tank and all that sort of thing. I'm really worried what they're doing here because my neighbour's already got signs of salt upstream. There's a well on his place that's been there for 90 years, and in the last couple of years it started to go salty. He's also got one of his dams fenced off from his stock because it's poisonous. They can't use it. So it worries me. I rely on the water that comes down Pollard Brook for watering my orchards and my grapes, and I'm just terrified that my asset is just going to be made useless. I'm not allowed to knock down one tree in here because of the AA catchment, and yet CALM and the Forest Products Commission are just over the fence knocking down thousands and thousands.
No one is more dedicated to the protection of Collie's forests and rivers than Ken Waterhouse.
This behind me is a classic example of the forest management that's taking place in and around the Collie recovery catchment. This is typical within a 20 kilometre, 30 kilometre radius of Collie at the present moment. Forestry comes in, Forest Products Commission, they log the forest, they go away, leave it full of debris, CALM follows behind, they burn it. And the end result is what you're seeing here behind me at the moment. Now, all through this forest area here, thousands and thousands of she oak trees have been pushed over, left and been burnt. The soil here now is sterile. As you can see, there's very limited ground cover, and this was burnt before Christmas 2002. The area is littered with charred logs that is no longer any good for habitat. The trees have been burnt 20, 30, 40 feet up to the crown, severely damaged, This is going to have problems in years to come. This timber will not grow properly. It's been recorded that burnt, charred forest trees, it causes problems in them. They finish up growing with a rot in the centre that makes them useless for furniture or productive logs.
Other factors impacting on the health of these forests include frequent prescribed burns. These result in the loss of forest floor mulch required for nutrient recycling. Forest canopy cover is reduced, resulting in loss of soil moisture and increased wind turbulence and evaporation. Stump coppice is the name given to the shoots that regrow from a tree stump. These often fall off the stump, and even if they do grow to maturity, they are usually of poor millable quality. These shoots, as well as ground coppice, are common in WA's overcut forests and are in direct competition with naturally occurring tree seedlings. This competition inhibits the growth rate of the regenerating forests. As part of its forestry activities, the Department of Conservation and Land Management carries out thinning operations in immature regrowth forest where it considers the trees are growing too closely together. The purpose of thinning is to manipulate the forest back to its original tree density and to speed up the growth rate of the trees that are retained. Thinning can be achieved through either chemical or mechanical means, and sometimes a combination of both. This forest has been thinned using chainsaws. Many of the remaining stumps are now coppicing, leaving the forest in worse condition than before. After thinning, the logs are simply left where they fell. These logs could be used for fencing, veranda posts, carports, at the very least firewood, but they have been left on the ground to rot or burn.
Well, here we've got a classic example of mismanagement. We've got a nice straight tree here, large size, cut. The white ants are getting into this as well. It's no good to anybody, being burnt.
Logging in the Collie region is largely driven by the requirements of Wesfarmers timber subsidiary Soteco and the Japanese-owned silicon plant Simcoa. Because most of the logs from these old-growth trees are of poor quality, most of the wood will end up at Simcoa, where it is turned into charcoal. This charcoal is then mixed in a furnace with quartz and sawdust in the process of silicon production. After considerable pressure from conservation groups, Simcoa told the Forest Products Commission that it would no longer accept freshly cut logs, or green char logs as they are called.
The logs here, they're all dry char logs. We haven't taken any green char logs now for some years. This is an issue we discussed through the conservation movement. We're very concerned as well that there was a possibility of trees being felled in order to supply Simcoa, and therefore we went across just to using dry char logs.
These so-called dry char logs amount to around 40,000 cubic metres a year and is only a portion of the Jarrah Simcoa uses. Although Simcoa claims they no longer take green char logs through the gate, it is still sourcing green logs by other means. This mechanical harvester, used for debarking logs, was found at the end of a remote track in Roseneath Forest. Inquiries revealed that these debarked green logs were sent to a mill to be chipped before being sent on to Simcoa. Simcoa claims this is an interim measure whilst other sources are found. However, while these trees are being cut down, Simcoa has a store of some 34,000 tonnes of jarrah at its site in Kemberton that could be used instead. Much of this stockpile has been there for several years. Simcoa also sources green logs that have been cut into blocks by external mills or turned into wood chip.
It's a question of whether us taking those mill ends is driving logging operations in any way at all. I honestly don't believe it is. Before Simcoa came along, these residues were being burnt in the incinerators, which most of the mills still have. If Simcoa were to stop taking these mill ends, I believe that they would just keep going and incinerate them as before.
The extent of Simcoa's jarrah use can best be observed from the air. Simcoa's continued use of jarrah from old-growth trees leave many people very concerned about their practices. Peter Murphy from the Preston Environment Group is at the forefront of a campaign to expose how the forests are being stripped of old-growth trees.
Your old-growth forest is not being saved. It's ending up here. Over 100,000 tonnes a year to feed a Fordendale multinational company. We call this here the equivalent to the elephant's graveyard. It's the abattoir of the jarrah forest.
Simcoa is presently using small amounts of low ash coal and pine as a substitute for jarrah. It's also looking at the option of sourcing most of its native forest wood from mine site clearing, a move that is receiving cautious support from conservation groups.
We're talking about a relatively short time frame moving away from logs, but that gets back very much to how quickly we can make the mine site residues work.
Forest clearing on Alcoa's bauxite mining alone results in some 50 to 100,000 cubic metres of wood going to waste each year. Alcoa's 80-year lease covers nearly 5,000 square kilometres of state forest in the Darling Range. From the air we can see wood that has been pushed into piles ready to be burnt. It is this wood Simcoa is hoping to source in the future. Trees, commonly known as hollow butts because their base has been hollowed out by fire, are often the only remaining old-growth trees left in forests after logging. Because they've been damaged by fire, they are of no commercial use. However, they are still living trees with great ecological values as habitat and for seed stock. Unfortunately, no effort is made to protect these trees from the intense burns routinely conducted after logging has been completed, and as a result, they are being destroyed. We are rapidly losing an important part of our heritage and causing irreversible environmental damage. These fallen hollow butts were all filmed in a small area, but the problem is endemic throughout WA's forests, including forests in conservation reserves and national parks. Already in Western Australia, we have seen how the massive overclearing of natural vegetation in the wheatbelt region has become a monumental disaster. Vast areas of land are no longer productive, with huge areas turning to salt. Jim Frith was a soil conservation advisor for the Department of Agriculture between 1968 and 1972.
The salinity problem has got much bigger than any of us ever thought at that stage. We knew the salt was there, we knew the process. I think there was a great underestimation of the quantities involved. The coming of the CSIRO hydrology teams put more exact quantities on it, and it's since then that we've got a proper measure of the disaster that lay ahead of us at the time and is now being realised. I think it's similar with the forests. Here we are logging them. We do not know what makes for ecological sustainability. We're flying blind in just the same sort of way.
Are we going to let our forest go down the same path as the wheat belt? Are we going to sit back and watch this magnificent gift of nature irreversibly destroyed for the sake of short-term corporate profits? It's almost too late for the wheat belt. It could soon be too late for the forests.